How do you define legalism? If you were going to put a definition on it, just think about that. How would you define legalism? Here's how I thought I would define it. Defining living for Christ or the worship of God for others. Making a definition that you apply your definition to everyone else. That's legalism. And it's legalism with anything we do when we apply our definition and enforce it upon others. Well, as we look at our text today, remember last week I talked about we were going to begin to look at the authority of Jesus Christ. Christ is going to now, he is pronouncing his authority. He's proclaiming it. Last week we saw his authority over illness, that he can heal as he chooses to heal. He walked into a multitude of people and healed this one person. Today we're going to look at his authority over the Sabbath. And let's take a deeper look at the Sabbath to understand that before we move on in our text. Turn to Exodus chapter 20. Verse 8 through 10. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days will you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you, or your son, or your daughter, or your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays in your house. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The Sabbath is a day of rest. The Sabbath also is part of the ceremonial law that Christ has fulfilled. We need to keep that in mind as we are studying, as we use the New Testament to enlighten the Old Testament. Jesus goes on to say in the other Gospels that the Sabbath was made for man, and man wasn't made for a Sabbath. What's the difference between worshiping on a Saturday or a Sunday? Why do we worship on Sunday? There's some debate about that, but I think it's pretty clear in my own way I consider it, because Paul mentions 2 times in the New Testament about gathering on the first day of the week. One is to take an offering, and the other is when we break bread together on the first day of the week, and he does that in Acts 20, verse 7, 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. The church, since recorded history, has met on the first day of the week, because that is the day Christ rose from the dead. We refer to it as the Lord's Day, and John does just that in Revelation 1:10. He saw his vision on the Lord's Day, which is Sunday. Well, let's go back to look at the Sabbath and how the Jews looked at the Sabbath. The nation of Judah, which was the southern kingdom, which was divided from the 10 tribes to the north, was held captive in Babylon for 70 years so that the broken Sabbaths would be paid for. And we see that in 2 Chronicles 36, verse 21. And it says, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbath, all the days of its desolation it kept its Sabbath until 70 years were complete. Jeremiah, in this warning, turn over to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 17. Jeremiah gives warning, and remember, this is a time of utter decay in Jerusalem. Jerusalem no one is honest. Everyone is crooked. Everyone is idol worshiping. People are being defrauded. And Jeremiah pronounces this to the king as he's telling them, you need to surrender, or God is going to allow the Babylonians to destroy the entire city. And they weren't listening. So in Jeremiah 17, 21 through 22, and then I'm going to read 27, Jeremiah says, thus saith the Lord, Take heed for yourselves, and do not carry any load on the Sabbath day, or bring anything in through the gates of Jerusalem. You shall not bring a load out of your houses on the Sabbath day, nor do any work, but keep the Sabbath day holy, as I commanded your forefathers. And look over to verse 27. But if you do not listen to me to keep the Sabbath day holy by not carrying a load and coming in through the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle a fire in its gates, and it will devour the palaces of Jerusalem, and it will not be quenched. What was Jeremiah talking about here? He's talking about keeping the Sabbath. But what Jeremiah's problem here is the hearts of the people. We need to understand the Sabbath correctly. What he's saying here is business as usual was going on the Sabbath. Loads of goods were coming and going through the gates of Jerusalem. They were buying and selling, and trade was going on, and work was going on, and all this idol worship was going on the Sabbath as usual. It was corrupt. This is what Jeremiah is addressing here. He's addressing the condition of their hearts on the Sabbath. The spirit of the Sabbath was that a person would rest from his daily occupation and worship God. That was the intention of Sabbath rest. D.A. Carson says this: acts of mercy, works of kindness that benefited other people fit the spirit of the command exactly. To forbid them was a complete and utter perversion of what God intended. Jesus' defense was that God was working on the Sabbath. Therefore, if God was working, then it was perfectly legitimate for Jesus to be working as well. And he speaks of that in verse 17. But the problem here is, to understand this, is by the time of Jesus, by the time Christ here was on the earth, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, the whole Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership had defined all things about the Sabbath. They had defined the Sabbath in detail in their own way. They were keeping the Sabbath apart from God. They were putting the Sabbath ahead of God in most every way here. Their own rules. The question is, what is a journey? What is traveling? What is a load? They added 39 categories in their own tradition that the people were forced to keep beyond the law. And I want to read a couple of paragraphs from James Montgomery Boyce, who tells a great deal about this. And it's almost like you're just going to shake your head. What? He says this: the difficulty lay in the fact that the leaders of Israel had added man's regulations to God's law, and this had reduced the observance of the Sabbath to the worst forms of legalism. For instance, the law said that a man could not travel on the Sabbath day. Exodus 16:29. But what was traveling, asked the scribes? What constitutes a journey? In answering this question, they developed the concept of a Sabbath day's journey, which was roughly 1,000 yards. So a man could walk that far on the Sabbath, but to walk any more was sin. If, however, a rope was tied across the end of the street, then the whole street was technically one house, and then a man could walk another 1,000 yards. This is literally in their stuff here. Or if he deposited food in any given place on Friday night, and he ate a meal in that place on the Sabbath day, that established that also as a home, and he could walk another 1,000. So if he were clever enough, I suppose this man could walk halfway across Palestine. Or take the matter of carrying a burden. The text in Jeremiah prohibits this. But what is a burden? Is a handkerchief a burden? And their answer was, yes it is, if it's carried, but not if it's worn. So obviously, to get a handkerchief out of your upstairs drawer and down to the downstairs drawer, you get it out of the drawer, put it around your neck, walk downstairs, take it off from your neck, and fold it and put it in its new location. It's no longer a burden. The same logic was also worked in this way, and this is the one that blows my mind. Take, for instance, a man is walking and he spits. Is that work? They defined it as such, if this. It depended on what happened to the saliva. If it went into the dirt and formed a furrow, then the man was plowing, and that was work. But if it hit a rock, then no work was done. So, under this system, being religious on Saturday was more or less dependent on which direction you spit. It just shows the ridiculousness of what this has gotten to. And we can learn from this. Let's see Jesus' attitude toward the ceremonial part of the law. Jesus gives us a great example of this, of the spirit of what the ceremony regulation should be. We turn to Matthew chapter 12. And in Matthew chapter 12, I'm going to read verses 1 through 8. Jesus here is addressing the Pharisees again on this same subject. Beginning in verse 1 in Matthew 12. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples became hungry, and they began to pick the heads of the grain. Again, this is like wheat or barley. They began to pick the heads of the grain and eat. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples do what is unlawful on the Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he became hungry, he and his companions? How he entered the house of God, and they ate the consecrated bread which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but for the priest alone? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? But I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I declare compassion and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent." And that account of David was when he's fleeing from Saul. And God permitted that. It was needed. This is what Jesus is saying. So let's go back to our text today in John. And I want to read verses 9 through 13 and let's look at those. I'm going to begin with the second part. I'll read the whole verse. Immediately the man became well, and he picked up his bed and began to walk. The talent, New American Standard uses talent. Now it was on the Sabbath day. So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, "It is the Sabbath, and it's not permissible for you to carry your bed." But he answered them, "He who made me well was the one who said, 'Pick up your bed and walk.'" And they asked him, "Who is this man who said to you, 'Pick up your bed and walk'?" But the man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. The Pharisees approached this man who had been ill for 38 years, remember. I think most of the people who ever went to Jerusalem knew this man was ill. He was there. He'd been there for a lifetime. So the Pharisees walk up and say, "Why are you carrying your bed?" Chuck Swindoll gives, I'm going to paraphrase his illustration because it demonstrates it very well. Say it's early Sunday morning and you have close neighbors in your neighborhood. You live next to a paraplegic who has never been able to walk and has always been in a wheelchair. And you're awakened very early in the morning to the sound of a lawnmower next door mowing the lawn. And you look out and your neighbor is push mowing his lawn. So you run out and you say, "What are you doing mowing lawn this time in the morning? You're waking the whole neighborhood up." This is about what the Pharisees, and you don't even notice the guy is healed. Right? That's what the Pharisees are doing. This man who had been ill for 38 years has rolled up his bedroll and he has carried it. He's went to the temple and they see him. "What are you doing carrying your bedroll?" Let alone you have legs again and you're perfectly healthy. There is the heartlessness. What is at the heart of this issue? What is at the heart of this issue? What it is the Pharisees wanted credit for themselves. They loved human merit because they thought they were full of that. They didn't need God's grace, but we're good. Remember the Pharisee who Jesus talked about was praying and said, "Thank you, Lord, that I'm not like this tax collector who's praying next to me." Remember that parable? Here is their heart. I don't need God's grace. We make the rules. I know the scripture. So I'm all set. And that's the problem. They were self-righteous. I don't need you, Jesus. I don't need what you're offering. They considered themselves better than other people. And that infuriated Jesus. Not only that they turned down his grace, but the way they treated people. These rules were a burden for everyone, and they watched everyone to see if they were breaking. Let's read 13 through 17, please. But the man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." The man went away and he told the Jews it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason, the Jews were persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But he answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." This man is not cast in a very good light. We don't see him very humble when Jesus asks him if he wants to be healed. He doesn't ask for healing. He immediately passes the buck to Jesus when they say, "Why are you carrying your bed?" "Well, the guy that healed me said I had to pick it up." Well, who was that? And as soon as he finds out, he runs to the Pharisees and said, "It was Jesus. That's who did it." And our text says Jesus found him in the temple. This wasn't coincidence. As with God, nothing's coincidence. Jesus went and found him in the temple and spoke to him. And he said these words, "Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." Speaking to this man's heart condition. Now, most illness is not the result of sin, but we can't say none is. We just can't say that by text of Scripture. I can quote like 1 Corinthians 11. Paul tells us there that when they took the Lord's Supper flippantly, with no regard for it, some of them were becoming ill and even dying. So there is this occasion. So what is Jesus talking about? Well, he's saying go and don't sin anymore. Is he saying go and live a sinless life for the rest of your life? We know that's impossible, right? It is impossible for us with a fallen nature. But he's saying this, I believe. He is referring to eternal wrath. He's saying, don't continue in this lifestyle of sin with total disregard for God. Something worse is going to happen to you. That puts it in context with what I believe Jesus is saying there. We conclude this section. I added 17 that Jesus said, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." What is he talking about? Well, he's talking about common grace and providence. God is not absent on any day of the week, is he? God is just never not there. When I say common grace, I mean it's grace that we're even breathing. It is grace we are alive in this world. And it is God's providence that we have what we have. And that is going on for the wicked, for the unsaved, as well as those who believe. That's common grace. That continues and that works. And Jesus here is projecting and really proclaiming his authority over the Sabbath. His authority to declare, what does the Sabbath mean? This is what it means. And the Jews were now persecuting Jesus, seeking to kill him over this because he did these things on the Sabbath. He did stuff. We're going to see there's more things he does on the Sabbath. But also because he proclaims himself to be equal with God. And we're going to see that in verse 18. But to be Lord over the Sabbath, he's equal with God. to define the Sabbath accurately. He is God. And he can do that to declare what this really means. How do we apply our text today? Well, I think there's three ways. The first is run away from legalism. Run. Our nature, the flesh, loves legalism. Our human nature loves merit. To check off boxes and say, I'm pretty good. Yeah. I did this and I did that and I didn't see you do either. That's legalism. That is self-righteous. Because we know for a fact that grace leaves no room for boasting. There is nothing to boast about in God's grace through Jesus Christ because God does it all. I have nothing to boast about but what he has given me. Praise God. And the Pharisees didn't like that because they liked to be important. They liked the prominent places at the table. They liked to be seen on the corner and everyone greet them as something special. And that's not God's way. Barnhouse says this, flee the horror of legalism that would bind us to days. When we are thus free, the Lord will possess our Mondays, our Tuesdays, our Wednesdays, our Thursdays, our Fridays, our Saturdays, and our Sundays. And all our days, our weeks, our months, our years, because he has bought us and possesses our hearts in simple grace. All belong to God. We belong to him in simple grace. It is not one day over another. Just look at a couple texts the Apostle Paul wrote. Let's look at Colossians 2:16-23, and we see first century churches here struggling with legalism, struggling with keeping certain days, eating certain things, doing certain rituals. There is freedom in Christ. There is liberty in Christ. So, Colossians 2:16-23. Therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink, in respect to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come. But the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by delighting in self-abasement, the worship of angels, taking his stand on visions he has seen, inflated without cause by his fleshly mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the entire body being supplied and held together by the joints and the ligaments grows with a growth which is from God. If you have died with Christ to the elementary principles of this world, why, as if you are living in the world, do you submit yourself to decrees such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which all refer to things destined to perish with you, in accordance with the commandments and teachings of men. These are matters which have to be sure the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion and self-abasement and the severe treatment of the body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. There is no spiritual growth in it. There is no grace in it. Turn back to Galatians. Look at Galatians chapter 4, verses 8-11. Paul here is dealing with the same thing. Judaism was coming in and they're saying, well, you've got to do this and you've got to do that. You've got this to-do list as well as added on to Christ. Beginning in verse 8 of chapter 4. However, at that time when you did not know God, you were slaves to those which were by nature no gods. But now that you have come to know God, or rather, to be known by God, how is it that you turn back again to the weak and worthless elemental things, to which you desired to be enslaved all over again? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. Run from legalism. Run from man's rules. And the second thing we should take away from our text today is treat other Christians with great love and grace. You can't put your ideas, if they're not biblical, you can't force them on another. There are biblical commands, absolutely. But there are also things that people regard as gray areas that how we perceive them, we can't push that on other people. Let's look at Romans 14. Romans chapter 14. And here Paul is dealing with the same thing. It is unique to this culture because here he is dealing with meat that had been sacrificed to idols. And some said, well, that's just a piece of stone and the meat's cheap and I have no problem eating it. And Paul said, if you really feel that way, it's okay. But for others who said, well, that's been sacrificed to idol, I'm not going to touch it. Paul said, well, then you feel that way, don't touch it. But he's telling, don't tell your neighbor what to do. So, beginning in verse 1. Now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats vegetables only. The one who eats is not to regard with contempt the one who does not eat, and the one who does not eat is not to judge the one who eats, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person regards one day above another. Another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it for the Lord, and he who eats does so for the Lord, for he gives thanks to God, and he who eats not for the Lord, he does not eat, and gives thanks to God. For not one of us lives for himself, and not one dies for himself, but we live. If we live for the Lord, and if we die for the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord both of the dead and the living. So, completely technically, we can't tell other people how to observe Sunday. Maybe you don't believe you should go to the store. But you can't condemn your brother or sister because they do. Some people need to work on Sunday. That's just a part of our culture now. It's what's in here that matters. That's what matters. When we think of the Sabbath, maybe we think of it on a Sunday, the principle of rest is intended. The principle of rest from your job is intended. It's healthy. It is good for your body and your spirit. So God's intention here is healthy, but it cannot be legalistic. It cannot be. It's contrary to Scripture. It's contrary to the commands of the church of how we're to treat one another. The third thing we learn is as we progress through John chapter 5 is the authority of Jesus Christ. He has the authority to tell us this, that this is what the Sabbath really means. David Platt says this about the authority of Christ in our lives, because that's really what's reflected. Do we allow his authority into our lives? Platt says, our autonomous desire for self-rule engages in a fierce battle with an appropriate desire to submit to the lordship of Jesus Christ. We win this battle only through the powerful work of Christ within us. Let him work within us. His authority. Submit to it. Trust in it, because that is belief. And rest in it, because that's where joy and peace come. He is sovereign. He can be trusted. He can be relied upon. We may not always understand his sovereign choices, as we talked about with the illness last week, and his choices in all things, but he can be trusted because he is God beyond our understanding or comprehension in any possible way. Jesus is Lord over sickness. He is Lord over the Sabbath. He can heal, and he can give rest. Jesus invites us to be restored and to be refreshed in him. God's grace comes from him and not of man. But we choose how we walk with him. And we're going to rely on him totally at peace and strength. What Jesus shows us as Lord over the Sabbath is this. Jesus shows us, that people are far more important than any ritual. They are far more important than any rule when it comes to the good of others, helping them. David in Psalm 51 says this very clearly, "For you do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offerings." The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Humbleness, God will never despise. Shall we pray? Father, I thank you for your goodness and your mercy. Help us, Lord, to open our hearts and minds to your word. Give us a deeper understanding, Lord, and bring it to our minds this week to apply. In Jesus' name, amen. Have a blessed week. If it's not raining tonight, come on up with your lawn chair and food. And like Nancy said, if there's any questions, just text us or tell you what it's doing up there, because sometimes what it's doing up there is different than what it's doing down here. Have a blessed week. And think about our text. Next week, I'd like you to read through Psalm 19. I'm going to preach through Psalm 19 next week. It's part of the praise service. Think about the glory of God. Thank you, Lord, for your blessing. Thank you for who you are. Thank you, Lord, for your great grace toward us. In Jesus' name.